Space enthusiasts everywhere, the wait is over, the time has come. Okay, that was a lie. That was just another static fire. But in the meantime, go on over to Boca Chica Gal's site. She does an excellent job of documenting all of this and subscribe to her channel. I mean, she does replays at different speeds, replays with no delay for sound from the rockets. Really impressive stuff. So head over there. She does a much better job than I ever could of documenting Boca Chica. This is, in fact, one of the reasons why I don't document Boca Chica very much, simply because there are people like her doing a better job. In the meantime, I talk about what's likely to come ahead, like, is the Starship likely to take flight and get to orbit in 2021? Well, although this obviously is a question that is better answered by rocket scientists, in my opinion, it is going to be very challenging indeed to get the Starship to orbit in 2021, because this is going to require not only a functional Starship, but obviously a functional Super Heavy, or the BFR as I like to continue to call it, just because I'm stubborn. I mean, when one considers that the BFR has more engines, a hell of a lot more engines, more fuel, a hell of a lot more fuel, more thrust than any rocket launched in history by far, and we need to stack both on top of each other and make the BFR come back to Earth and land successfully, and okay, I'll start calling it the Super Heavy again. This is a really difficult engineering process that we've barely begun. Can we really do it in 1 year? And in the meantime, interestingly enough, SpaceX has another heavy lift rocket that has already proven itself and yet was not used even once in 2020. In my opinion, this is a bit of a mistake. SpaceX could start establishing itself in much larger ways, not only in low Earth orbit, but elsewhere with this rocket in ways that the Falcon 9 is simply not able to. As a matter of fact, Elon Musk's original plan was to use this rocket to get the human species to Mars. How? Well, I'm going to explain all of that and more in just a few minutes. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. I happen to be particularly angry today. Some of you may notice that the angles are a little bit different as to how I'm shooting this right now, and that's because, well, at Denver International Airport, right where my shuttle parked, there happened to be some water and also a fair amount of ice right where they were unloading. And I took the worst fall that I've taken in 30 years on my back on the asphalt, and some of my equipment got damaged, including my tripod. Fortunately, I have a backup tripod that's linked in with my lighting and all that, so rather than buy a new tripod today, I really wanted to get another episode out before the SN8 hop. I thought that this would be very important, because this is a historic moment, right? I mean, the SN8 is finally going to be achieving some very substantial altitudes and going to be attempting to land as the Starship is supposed to be landing. I mean, it's a pretty huge moment. There's a lot of things that it's not going to tell us, but nevertheless, it's really going to give us a definitive answer as to whether or not the Starship takeoff and landing procedure, at least as we have it planned right now, is viable. Now, of course, it's going to be taking off from Earth using the Super Heavy, but it's going to be taking off from Mars just using the engines that it has. And that's, of course, because of the much lower gravity on Mars, as most of you folks know. But still, there's a lot that's missing. This is just the first step. And yet Elon is talking about the Starship achieving orbit by the end of 2021. And I'm here to tell you that that is going to be an extremely tall order because, as most of us know, the Starship cannot achieve orbit without the Super Heavy. Technically, it can, but as Elon has already stated, there's no point. You would have to strip down the Starship so much in order for it to achieve orbit with its normal engines, assuming that that's even possible, and it would have no heat shield or anything else and simply burn up on re-entry. There's no point to doing that. For the Starship to be used as it's supposed to be used, we need the Super Heavy as well. And there is a long road ahead of us when it comes to the Super Heavy. And I'm not saying that achieving orbit in 2021 is impossible, but it's going to be an extremely difficult prospect. And in the meantime, I think that SpaceX should be putting more emphasis onto a rocket that they have that can already fly, and that is the Falcon Heavy, a rocket that's seen very little use and yet has a huge lift capacity and could potentially take cargoes to the moon. And yet it's only launched 3 times. And personally, I think it could be used for a whole lot more. And while the Starship is still in development, and this development could take quite a while, I think the Falcon Heavy should be used as well. In any event, we're going to talk all about that right now. The Super Heavy has gone through a number of changes since its original conception. In spite of what this diagram might say, Elon says that it will have 31 Raptor engines rather than 37. But still, it's a tremendous number of engines. The biggest and most ambitious rocket when it comes to thrust capability since the Russian N-1. Now, of course, it's best not to make those kinds of comparisons because all the N1 was good at doing was blowing up. But still, when you compare it to the Saturn V, the Starship is just a mammoth big brother, and it has a lot more engines, therefore a lot more points of failure. Now, it could probably lose 1 or 2 or perhaps even more of these engines and still achieve orbit, but still, the more engines you have, the more potential for failure. Now, this is not to say that the Starship is a bad design or that the Super Heavy is a bad design, only to say that quite a lot of testing and quite a lot of static fires are going to be required before we attempt to get the Super Heavy off the ground. Thus far, all we've managed to do is 3 Raptor engines simultaneously in a static fire on the Starship. The Super Heavy is going to require a hell of a lot more than that. On top of that, it has nearly triple the amount of fuel that the Starship does, which means a lot more pressure tests, a lot more putting the stainless steel structure of the rocket to the test, a lot more in the future for the Super Heavy that is only barely begun. Now, I may be spouting blasphemy here, but the entire process could potentially be speeded up by SpaceX taking a page out of the NASA playbook. They have orbital ATK testing and static firing the solid rocket boosters for the SLS, while they have Aerojet Rocketdyne handling the rest of the engines. Now, does this mean that SpaceX needs to subcontract other companies? Certainly not, but having a second facility working on the Super Heavy, perhaps even in Boca Chica just a few miles away, might actually speed up this process if we had two teams working on the two components of the Starship at the same time, rather than doing things in a linear fashion as they're doing right now. Now, of course, SpaceX is currently working on the Super Heavy at Boca Chica, but how much more could they accomplish if they had a separate launch pad and a separate location to do pressure tests for the fuel tanks and static fires for the engines to be carried out at roughly the same time as everything they're doing with the Starship right now? Yes, it would cost more money, but if Elon wants to get the Starship into orbit by the end of 2021, doing something like this would probably be an efficient solution. Now, no doubt SpaceX has considered doing this, but I have yet to find any information to indicate why they haven't. It could be financial, or it could be that they aren't confident enough yet in the Starship's current design, and it may require modifications to the Super Heavy to get a new version of the Starship aloft, and they don't want to invest money in that part of the rocket until they're certain of the stability and viability of the Starship. Either way, it does slow things down. In addition, SpaceX can ill afford things like this to happen to the Super Heavy. Losing one prototype and one Raptor engine is one thing, but losing dozens or perhaps more Raptor engines and a much larger prototype is another matter entirely, not only financially, but also for the safety of the people on the ground. In fact, when the Soviet N-1 exploded, it created the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history, perhaps not including the recent tragic explosion in Lebanon. But what's my point behind all of this? Well, as the Starship develops and perhaps takes longer to become operational, SpaceX has a very effective heavy lift rocket already. The Falcon Heavy, which by the way is still the most powerful rocket on the planet, is capable of lofting 63.8 metric tons to low Earth orbit and 16.8 metric tons all the way to Mars. That's actually a very impressive capability. And to add to that, I really think that Elon Musk might want to reconsider making this thing human-rated, especially considering his recent announcement that there's going to be hundreds of flights of the Starship with cargo only before he risks passengers on board. Enter perhaps the most controversial rocket scientist on the planet, Robert Zubrin, and he's advocating for something called the Gray Dragon. Zubrin argues that since the Crew Dragon has a total mass of about 9.5 tons as opposed to the 26.5 tons of the Orion, it's a much better vehicle to get man to the moon. Not to the moon's surface, but to the lunar gateway. And keep in mind, Elon originally wanted something called the Red Dragon to set down on Mars, before the Starship came along, that is. Now, the Falcon Heavy is already deploying the first two components of the Lunar Gateway at a far reduced price of the original plan with the SLS, and if Zubrin's plan were to be adopted, the Falcon Heavy could potentially save the entire Artemis project, because as funding for this project continues to be in doubt, it would be so much less expensive to send human beings to the Gateway at $90 million a launch versus $1 billion a launch. Plus, the Falcon Heavy is already flying, whereas the SLS is not. Once again, the Falcon Heavy needs to be human-rated, but given the fact that the Falcon 9 that it's based on is human-rated, that might not be as difficult a task as people are thinking. And as recently as 2017, before Dear Moon was even a thing, Elon was talking about sending 2 tourists to orbit the moon using a modified version of the Crew Dragon. How much do you suppose people might pay to see a sight like this for the first time in half a century? Quite a lot, probably. And not only that, it's not just tourists. Scientists could gather so much more from this at such a reduced cost if the Falcon Heavy were human-rated. And it's not just the moon that we're talking about here. Thanks to the US military, they've recently certified the Falcon Heavy for their uses as well, although they're going to require an increased fairing size in order to carry some of their larger satellites to higher orbits. And this has been the Falcon Heavy's Achilles heel for quite some time. Although it can carry a very large amount of payload, it's in a restricted area. And as you can see from this diagram, the ULA fairing sizes are much larger than the Falcon Heavy. And even though the Vulcan Centaur can't carry as much mass, they can carry a lot more volume. Ironically, the Vulcan Centaur could actually deploy more Starlink satellites than the Falcon Heavy or the Falcon 9, and this needs to be rectified. As we all know, Starlink is Elon's big gamble for big money in the future, and the quicker he can put these satellites into orbit, the better. And a Falcon Heavy with an improved fairing could deploy a lot more than 60 of these at a time. Granted, at an increased price, but still, they would deploy faster, which is the whole point. Then there's the world of private space stations. A company called Orion Span, who I've mentioned before on this channel, is planning to put up a station called Aurora using SpaceX technology. Originally they were planning to use Falcon 9s, but Falcon Heavies could launch much more ambitious stations. And as you can see, the Crew Dragon is docked to this thing. Aurora is designed for space tourism and also private experiments, including the manufacture of materials that can only be manufactured in microgravity, such as certain specialized types of carbon fiber. And they can do all of this similar to the ISS, but at a fraction of the price. And they want SpaceX to come along for the ride. My point is that even without the Starship, SpaceX can revolutionize man's presence in space, not only in terms of private space stations, not only in terms of getting man to the moon, which is lofty enough ambitions, but also perhaps even getting us to Mars. And no, I'm not talking about resurrecting the Red Dragon. I agree with Elon. That concept is unlikely to get humans safely to the Red Planet and back. It's just too small and too difficult to land on a planet with that kind of atmosphere. But at the same time, there's a lot of other things we could do on Mars with the Falcon Heavy's capabilities. For example, the Falcon Heavy could deploy a small version of one of the 3D printed designs that have been winning all of these contests from NASA. Most of the materials are locally made from Martian regolith and other substances, and really only the construction equipment, all robotic, needs to be deployed. And I have a feeling that it could probably be done for less than 20 tons. So, in essence, we could start staging man's presence on Mars with these experiments, and not just habitats. We could do it with ice mining, or the manufacture of fuel on the surface. All of these things which the Starship is going to need to be successful could be experimented with at a very low cost using the Falcon Heavy. And the fact of the matter is, if SpaceX doesn't do this, somebody else will. ULA has already stated their objective of setting up a cislunar economy, utilizing their new Vulcan Centaur rocket and its reusable second stage. Now granted, this second stage isn't in use yet, but it will be soon, and if they're able to put this comprehensive plan in place before the Starship is operational, they will have a competitive edge over SpaceX, unless SpaceX starts making more use of the Falcon Heavy and improves the size of their fairing, which they're starting to do, But nevertheless, they need to be doing it with as much enthusiasm as they're working on the Starship. Now, look, in my opinion, this is the future of the human species, the future of manned space flight, the most sophisticated, reusable vessel that's ever been built in human history. But things like that take time to develop. They don't happen overnight, as we've seen recently. And in the meantime, rather than just sitting around and waiting for what happens in Boca Chica, there are many things we can still do. So, I want to make one thing completely clear. I'm not sitting here telling you that there's no way the Starship is going to achieve orbit by 2021. It is possible, but given how the development of the Starship thus far has been going, and given the fact that we're taking essentially a linear approach to this development rather than a side by side approach, honestly, as I think SpaceX should be doing, have an entirely separate facility in Texas, perhaps somewhere near their Boca Chica facility, perhaps just a few miles away, might be a good idea so that we can simultaneously develop both projects, assuming that SpaceX has the money to do that. Now, of course, I'm sure this is something that they've considered, and it's something, of course, that would involve a lot more money and, of course, a lot more risk too, because if the Starship ends up not being viable, if it turns out to not work and SpaceX has to pursue another option, then the Super Heavy is a complete waste of money. But nevertheless, if Elon wants to get the Starship completed as rapidly as possible and to get it to orbit as rapidly as possible, I think that he should have another launch pad a few miles away with simultaneous experiments going on and test launches, static fires, etc., going on with the Super Heavy. And in the meantime, the Falcon Heavy can achieve so much. It can lift over half the capacity of the Starship, at least mass wise, into orbit. There are so many things that the Falcon Heavy can accomplish: building space stations, building orbiting solar arrays, so many different functions that this rocket has, and it's very inexpensive, only $90 million per launch, which granted is a lot more than the Starship, theoretically, but still way, way less expensive than rocket launches used to be in the past, especially for this kind of mass to low Earth orbit. In my opinion, the Falcon Heavy should not be a forgotten rocket, and we should have a lot more launches going on, an increased fairing size to deploy more of the Starlink satellites. At the very least, it would certainly be able to accomplish that if it had a larger fairing. And that, at the very least, would allow SpaceX to get Starlink operational fast enough. But you've heard me say all of this in the video, and I guess I'm just kind of beating a dead horse here. But I think there are alternatives. There are ways that SpaceX might be able to speed up this process and also increase their presence in low Earth orbit and perhaps even to places like the moon and beyond with the Falcon Heavy, if they can get it human rated, or even if they just want to send unmanned missions far beyond what NASA has already contracted them to do. I think that there are many, many other companies on this planet that would love to make use of the Falcon Heavy and its capabilities if it just had a larger fairing size than it currently has. Let's hope that's something that happens. Let's hope that the Falcon Heavy doesn't become a forgotten rocket, because I think that relying on waiting for the Starship may prove to be a mistake if things take longer than we're anticipating. But that's just my opinion. I'll be interested to see what you say in the comments. The mug is back, and I can hardly wait to blow it up. I'm less than 8,000 subscriptions away from blowing this thing up. And man, I can't wait to drink my coffee from something else. So, if you want to support this channel, it talks about unusual topics, things beyond the Starship, things that SpaceX can do that, go beyond what's happening at Boca Chica, as I often do. And in addition to that, things about Boca Chica, maybe from a perspective that other folks may not take, then you know how to support me. It's all in the description. Lots of different ways, from merch to Patreon to this Starship. If you want one of your own, there's certainly a way to do that as well, and it's all in the description if you want one for Christmas. So, until the Starship is ready for flight, and until we start making greater use of the remarkable rocket that is the Falcon Heavy, and something that I think that could be used to increase man's presence in space if we just have the innovation and thinking outside the box ability, as I talk about all the time, to get mankind into space by any means necessary. I urge all of you to stay angry about space.